On the 5th of September 1548, Catherine Parr died. She was 36 years old. She had outlasted a king that most people did not outlast. She had survived 4 marriages, a court full of enemies, and at least one serious attempt to have her arrested and burned as a heretic. She had done all of that, and she had done it with intelligence, grace, and a quiet determination that her contemporaries found either admirable or deeply unsettling, depending on which side of her they found themselves on. She died at Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire, 2 weeks after giving birth to her daughter Mary. The cause was childbed fever. Her husband, Thomas Seymour, was in the castle when it happened. He did not stay long afterwards. 2 days later, she was buried in the chapel of St. Mary's, a short walk from where she died. The funeral was the first Protestant burial service ever held in England. Lady Jane Grey, 15 years old and already being shaped into someone else's instrument, served as chief mourner. And then the world moved on, quickly, as it tends to do. What happened to Catherine Parr after that burial is one of the strangest, most disturbing, and most overlooked stories in Tudor history. Her tomb would be lost, found, opened, violated, desecrated by drunken men with an iron bar, buried upside down in a hidden grave, and finally reduced to a little brown dust and a tangle of ivy roots. Imagine if this happened to someone you loved, if their resting place and the memory you wanted to protect were treated this way. How would you feel, knowing the story ended not with respect, but with erasure and carelessness? It's worth asking how we might react if the dignity denied to Katherine had been denied to one of our own. The woman who survived everything could not, it turned out, rest in peace. Before we go any further, I want to tell you something that reframes everything that comes after. When Catherine's tomb was first broken open in 1782, more than 200 years after her death, the women who stood over that opened coffin found her perfectly preserved. Eyes open. Skin is white and moist. Hair still that famous burnished gold. Dressed not in a shroud, but in costly burial clothes, shoes on her features still carrying, in the words of one witness, traces of beauty. 234 years in the ground, and she looked, to the people standing over her, like she was sleeping. That discovery should have been the end of the story, a remarkable footnote in Tudor history. A queen found, marveled at, and properly reinterred with the dignity she deserved. Instead, it was the beginning of something far darker. Because once people knew she was there, they could not leave her alone. And what followed over the next decade was not curiosity. It was something uglier than that. Something that says as much about how the world regarded this woman in death as it did in life. It is worth noting that treatment like this was not unique to Catherine Parr. The graves of women, especially women seen as controversial, powerful, or simply out of place, were often disturbed, neglected, or desecrated throughout history. Even the graves of royalty, such as those of Anne Boleyn and Mary, Queen of Scots, were subject to exhumation or disregard in later centuries. In contrast, the tombs of powerful men were far more likely to be protected, restored, and venerated. Catherine's story is part of a larger pattern of posthumous treatment that reflects not only personal disregard, but also broader attitudes toward women and their legacies. To understand what was done to Catherine Parr's remains, you first need to understand who she was and what she had built in life. Because the indignity of her afterlife stands in direct, jarring contrast to the woman who earned her place in history. Catherine was born around 1512, the daughter of Sir Thomas Parr of Kendal. She was educated to a standard unusual for women of her time, fluent in several languages, deeply engaged with the theological debates of the Reformation, and possessed of a political intelligence sharp enough to navigate the court of Henry VIII without becoming one of its casualties. That last part was considerably harder than it sounds. She married Henry in 1543, his sixth and final wife, already a widow twice over. She managed him with remarkable skill, kept her head at a time when keeping your head was not guaranteed, and used her position as queen to quietly advance the cause of Protestant reform and the education of the royal children. She published under her own name, becoming the first woman to do so in England. She brought the future Elizabeth I and Edward VI back into their father's court and into his will. When Henry died in 1547, she was finally free to marry the man she had wanted, before Henry had required her to set that want aside. Thomas Seymour was charming, reckless, and wildly ambitious. Not the safest choice, but Katherine loved him, and she chose him. She was pregnant within months. She died before she could see what Seymour would become without her steadying influence. Within 2 years of her death, he was executed for treason. Their daughter Mary, born just weeks before Katherine died, disappears from the historical record almost immediately. Nobody quite knows what happened to her. Katherine herself was buried at Sudeley, and the world turned its attention elsewhere. The civil war that tore England apart in the 1640s was not kind to Sudeley Castle. Roundhead soldiers occupied it, damaged it, and in the process desecrated the chapel of St. Mary's where Katherine lay. Monuments were smashed, graves were disturbed. The chapel roof was eventually demolished on Parliament's orders, leaving the building open to the sky and to whatever the English weather chose to do with it. For the next century and more, Sudeley was a ruin. The chapel was filled with weeds and fallen stone. Katherine's tomb, whatever had remained of it after the soldiers had finished, disappeared under the accumulating neglect of decades. By the mid-18th century, the precise location of her burial was uncertain. The Queen, who had been buried with the first Protestant funeral service in English history, had been, in the most literal sense, lost. There is something quietly devastating about that. A woman of such intelligence and accomplishment, reduced to an approximate location in a ruined chapel in Gloucestershire, her grave unmarked and uncertain, while the men she had outlived and outlasted were commemorated in cathedrals and state monuments across the country. This difference is not an accident. Throughout history, the physical remembrance of prominent women has often been overlooked or neglected. While men's legacies are made visible in grand tombs, monuments, and carefully maintained sites, women, even those who shape the very course of events, are more likely to find their graves lost, forgotten, or left unmarked. The reasons are complex, rooted in attitudes that regarded women's influence as private, fleeting, or less worth recording for posterity. In Katherine's case, the vanishing of her memorial was not just a personal erasure, but part of a broader pattern of how the achievements and memories of women are treated, both in death and by those who curate the stories that follow. But the story was not over, not even close. In 1782, a group of women asked permission to try to locate the tomb. They had a genuine interest in Katherine, a sense that she deserved better than to lie forgotten under a ruined floor, and they began searching carefully through the rubble and earth of the chapel. They found her about 2 feet below the surface. What they saw when that coffin was opened stopped them cold. Catherine Parr, dead for 234 years, lay before them in a state of almost complete preservation. Her eyes were open, staring upward. Her skin was described as white and moist. Her hair, that famous burnished gold that contemporaries had always remarked upon, was still intact around her face. She was dressed not in a plain shroud, but in what appeared to be her actual burial clothes, layered linen wrappings over what one witness described as costly garments. There were shoes on her feet. Small feet, one observer noted, with something that reads almost like surprise. The women were disturbed enough by what they had found that they ordered the earth thrown back without properly resealing the coffin. They had found what they were looking for. They did not linger. That should have been the end of it. But word got out. Of course it did. A perfectly preserved Tudor queen, 2 centuries in the ground, was found in a ruined chapel in Gloucestershire. It was the kind of discovery that travels. That same year, a man named John Lucas, who lived in the outer part of the castle, went to the grave and tore open the top of the coffin himself. He found the body exactly as the women had described. He made an incision through the cloth covering one of Catherine's arms. The flesh beneath was, he reported, white and moist. He had done what he came to do, and he left. The following year, the steward to Lord Rivers directed that the grave be opened again. To satisfy his curiosity, the record states. Just that, curiosity. The body was found to have begun deteriorating, the repeated exposure to air doing what 2 centuries of burial had not. He resealed it and left. In 1784, it reopened. This time, an old woman present recorded her observations in some detail. Catherine's burial clothes were still visible. Her feet were still small. Her hair was still gold. Her features, even now, still carried traces of the woman she had been. But the deterioration was accelerating. Each opening was taking something that could not be replaced. Nobody stopped. Nobody thought to stop. In 1792, a group of men broke into the coffin. The accounts of what followed are brief, factual, and quietly horrifying. The men were reportedly drunk. What they did to Catherine Parr's remains in that ruined chapel on that night was not curiosity, not scholarship, not any impulse that can be dressed up in reasonable language. They pulled off her hair. They knocked out her teeth. They took an iron bar and drove it through her torso. Several times. A woman who had survived Henry VIII. She had published books under her own name, who had helped shape the religious and intellectual landscape of Reformation England, who had finally, at the end of her life, found something that looked like happiness, reduced, in the end, to this. Joseph Lucas, presumably related to the John Lucas who had cut into her arm a decade earlier, reinterred what remained in a hidden walled grave. He placed the coffin upside down, perhaps to deter further interference. He sealed the location as best he could and said nothing publicly about where she now lay. In 1817, the rector of Sudeley finally located Catherine's hidden grave. When the coffin was opened, there was almost nothing left. A bare skeleton, a few shreds of cloth, a small quantity of dark-coloured hair, darker now than it had been, the gold long gone. And ivy. The roots had penetrated the coffin and filled much of the interior, winding themselves around and through the bones, forming what one observer described as a green sepulchral coronet around the Queen's skull. It is one of the most extraordinary images in this entire story. The ivy growing through the skull of a Tudor queen, patient and indifferent, doing what ivy does. She was reinterred again, more carefully this time, and Sudeley Castle slowly began its long recovery from ruin. By 1861, when the remains were examined once more, there was almost nothing left at all. A little brown dust, the faintest traces of what had once been there. In the Victorian era, a proper tomb was finally commissioned. Designed by the architect Sir George Gilbert Scott, it featured a full-length effigy of Katherine in white marble, a canopy of ornately carved stone, and all the dignity that had been so comprehensively absent from everything that had come before. The tomb that stands in St Mary's Chapel today is a Victorian reconstruction of the respect she should always have been shown. It is beautiful, and it came about 3 centuries too late. The story of what happened to Catherine Parr's tomb is shocking on its own terms. The repeated openings, the deterioration caused by careless hands. The night in 1792 when men with an iron bar did what they did and walked away. These things are disturbing simply as events, but there is a pattern beneath them worth sitting with. Catherine Parr, in life, was consistently underestimated and overlooked. She was the sixth wife, which in the popular imagination means she was the last one, the afterthought, the one history remembers only because she had the good sense not to be executed. The idea that she was one of the most intellectually accomplished women of the Tudor period, a published author, a skilled political operator, a queen who genuinely shaped the course of the Reformation in England, tends to get lost somewhere between wife 5 and wife 6. In death, that pattern continued. Her burial was hasty. Her tomb was neglected. When she was finally found, the people who found her did not show reverence. It was curiosity first, then carelessness, and then something that in 1792 became outright violence. The men who drove an iron bar through her body were not acting in isolation. They were the extreme end of a continuum of people who had treated her remains as an object of interest, rather than a person deserving of dignity. None of that was accidental. Women's graves in this period were not treated with the same weight as men's. A king, a bishop, a great nobleman would not have been dug up repeatedly to satisfy the curiosity of passing strangers. The idea that Catherine's remarkable preservation was something to be prodded and examined, and eventually violated, rather than something to be protected and honoured, reflects something specific about how her world valued, or failed to value, women. Today, there is a far greater awareness of the need to respect and preserve the resting places and legacies of women, especially those whose contributions were once overlooked. In many countries, restoration projects and new scholarship have tried to recover and properly honour women's histories. Yet, even now, the graves and stories of women can be left neglected or face a lack of public memory, especially if they do not fit the dominant narratives or are seen as less important than their male contemporaries. Remembering Catherine Parr is not just about the past, it is part of an ongoing effort to change how we honour and remember women, ensuring their stories are not erased again. She survived Henry VIII. She survived the plots against her. She survived long enough to find something like happiness. And then death came, and with it a kind of treatment that her intelligence, her accomplishments, and her dignity had done nothing to protect her from. The Victorian tomb is beautiful, but the woman underneath it deserved better from the centuries that came before. And the fact that almost nobody knows this story happened is perhaps the final chapter of the same long tale. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the stories that were always there, waiting to be told properly, subscribe. There are more of them, far more than you might think. I have always been drawn to stories like Catherine Parr's, not just because they are extraordinary, but because they remind us how easily a person's impact can be buried, literally and figuratively. When I first learned what happened to her grave, I kept wondering what it means that a queen's resting place could be forgotten and violated, her story left in the shadows. Researching and sharing these overlooked histories is our way of keeping their memory alive, and maybe changing how we all think about who and what gets remembered. That's why we tell these stories, and why I hope you'll join me for the next one.